All right, so I'm going to kick things off because we have a lot of things to cover. And RxJS is a big topic, as you know. It's one of the most difficult things when we get started with Angular. And so I'm going to start from scratch. The goal with this workshop is really to assume that you don't know anything about RxJS. And I want to start, from the very basics. The reason for this is because sometimes we start with the wrong foot with RxJS, and we have an apprehension from that, and then the way we work around, basically we try to avoid RxJS because we don't really understand how it works or what's going on behind the scenes. So that's why I really want to start from the very basics, so you get a different perspective on the RxJS, and hopefully that makes it easier for you to see it as really something that can help you rather than something tricky to learn about. And yeah, that's not really obvious to get into. So before we start, a few words about myself. My name is Alan, or just Al. I'm a Google developer expert in Angular and Google Maps. I've been working with Angular for way too long now. Started with AngularJS back in 2011. And what I do for a living is that I'm a consultant and technical trainer at angulartraining.com, which is my own company, my own website. I blog every week about Angular. There's a weekly newsletter, which is free as well, and you can subscribe to it. And yeah, my job really is to create content, training tutorials, and do talks on Angular for the most part. So I've been speaking at conferences all around the world on every single continent but Antarctica, but it doesn't really count. And yeah, I'm an Angular guy. That's really the essence of it. And something that I started a few years ago with other Google developer experts is the Angular certification program. So if you're an Angular developer and you want to showcase your skills, maybe you're looking for another job, or you just want to get promoted at your current job, those are all different use cases for which people like to get a certification. So you can go to courses.angulartraining.com. We have 3 levels of certification. It's the only certification in the world run by Google developer experts. We have people certified in 70 plus countries. We have interviewers on all continents as well. So people are, because for level 2 and level 3, the last step is an interview. And so we can do that interview in your language, in your time zone. We have people everywhere that speak, Spanish, French, German, Italian, Vietnamese, English, of course, Portuguese, and many more languages. So yeah, feel free to take a look. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me, and I'll be happy to give you more info if needed. And the last thing I want to mention before getting into RxJS is that this workshop is free. But as you can guess, it takes a lot of work to create such a workshop and all of the exercises and examples that go with it. So if you want to support that work, you can do so very easily with just a cup of coffee. So I have that URL, buymeacoffee.com/angulartraining, and I'll put it in the chat so that you can access it. And if you want to buy me some coffee, then feel free to do so. I always like coffee, and that's the easiest way to to say thank you and show appreciation and basically keep me going with those monthly workshops. So RxJS is our topic for today. So first question I like to start with a few of these questions to get an idea of where you all stand, what's your level of experience and such. So if you're new to Angular or just started with the framework a few weeks or a few months ago, you can raise your virtual hand. So I know that Zoom has this feature where you can raise your hand. So if you're very new to the framework, you can do that, and I'll see that showing up in the list of participants. So I don't see any beginners in here. Now, who has some experience with Angular but still confused by RxJs, observables, and such? Okay, looks like, and usually that's where a lot of people fall, right? In these different categories, like we know Angular, but RxJS is still a little bit scary, or it doesn't always seem to make sense, or it seems overly complex at times, and all of that. And the last one is, anyone feels comfortable with RxJS but still want to attend this workshop just in case? Okay, perfect. So thank you for your votes. That gives me a good idea. And yeah, the goal really, again, we're gonna start from scratch. So assuming you don't know anything, and that's because sometimes we miss from the very basics, and that's the part that we miss from the very basics that creates confusion. So just starting from the bare basics can be very, very helpful. So if you want to access these slides, because the slides have quite a few links to exercises and the solutions of these exercises and more. So I'll put the link in the chat here. You can also scan the QR code if you want to. But yeah, the link is now in the chat. So feel free to use that. And so yeah, now we're going to get into what is RxJS. So the main idea behind RxJS is to give us a way to implement what is called reactive programming, which is really all about having our code react to changes. And it's doing so using an object, a main type of object called an observable, right? And an observable is really a way to give us support for passing messages between publishers and subscribers. That's really the essence of what an observable is all about. So usually in an Angular application, we would have services, and these services, they manage our data. And when the data gets updated, when there's a change, and we want to notify our components or maybe other services even, we're going to emit that data. We're going to send a message, and that's what an observable is going to help us do. So it's going to help us publish information and have other pieces of code, other components or services subscribe to that information and then receive updates as they happen. So that's really the main idea behind observables. And this concept of subscribing to a data source, receiving messages, it's not something new, right? It's been existing for years. It's a very common design pattern, the observer design pattern. You can read books on that date back from the 60s or 70s, so a long time ago. And yeah, the RxJS is an implementation of that for JavaScript. So one of the reasons why they're used in Angular, and one of the reasons why they are very helpful, is because they help us deal with asynchronous programming, which means that when we have tasks that take some time to complete, like we start a task, it's going to do something in the background, usually an HTTP request, and then we get the response a few seconds, milliseconds later. Observables are perfect for that. They have the pattern, the syntax to make that a lot easier, and to ease how we can subscribe to such a data source and receive data as it happens later on. So observables implement the observer design pattern. The official website is reactivex.io. And if you go there, you'll see that ReactiveX is not just a JavaScript thing. There's an implementation for Java. There's an implementation for .NET. There's RxJs, which is what we use with JavaScript, but there's also many more. So there's a RxPython, there's a RxRuby, Swift, PHP, Dart, C++. Most of the common languages are here, right? So that's important to know. It's not specific to Angular. It's not specific to JavaScript. You can use that same idea of observables and operators and everything we're going to talk about with other technologies, other languages as well. So it's not, 100% specific to the web. We are just using, RxJS or ReactiveX for JavaScript with Angular because it's the implementation that works best for us. So in the case of the Angular framework, observables are in different places. There are a few services and a few objects in the Angular framework that rely on RxJS. The one that we use the most often, I would say, is the third scenario here. So when we use the HTTP client from Angular, any HTTP request that we make returns an observable. So that's kind of the use case we cannot avoid, right? It's always there. It's really the thing that we do most often. We make a request to a server, we get an observable, so we have to subscribe to it to get our data. But there's other places where observables are present. Another common one is reactive forms. So if you use reactive forms with Angular, all of the form input values and everything form related, like the validation state, the current value and everything, can be accessed as an observable as well. And there are other services such as the router, for instance. The Angular router has an observable to subscribe and get notified when the URL changes in the browser. So that's another example of API of the framework that exposes some observables. There's not that many, by the way, and that's something that the Angular team mentioned not long ago. RxJS is not that present in Angular itself, right? The framework itself doesn't rely that heavily on RxJS. And that's why with the emergence of signals, there's a future for Angular possibly without RxJS. So that's something to keep in mind, that the framework itself does use a little bit of RxJS, but not that much. And internally, they don't use it at all for things like change detection and propagating information within the framework. There's literally no RxJS in there. They only use it for the APIs that they expose to us, like in the forms, in the router, and with the HTTP client. And by the way, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to type them in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer either right away or after some time. I'm going to pause and take a look at the questions there and answer them. So the main pattern of an observable, the main thing that you've probably all done at this point, is that when you get an observable, you have to subscribe to it. If you don't subscribe to an observable, nothing happens. And that's one of the most common mistakes that I see in Angular code still today, even people with experience make that mistakes, is that they have an observable, but they don't subscribe to it. If you don't subscribe to it, nothing happens. The HTTP client is not going to make an HTTP request if there's no subscription. You need to subscribe in order to trigger the observable for it to do something, right? And when we subscribe to an observable, the idea is that we register a function. So we pass a function as a parameter here, and that function is going to be called whenever the observable emits a new value. So when there's a new value, this function is going to run, and inside that function, we can add the code that we want to run every time a new value is happening. That's really the essence of it. So I have a short demo here. I'm going to click here. It gets us to StackBlitz, where we have an example running. So it's a very basic example. We have a dropdown that's going to show up. And that dropdown is a form control. So I'm using reactive forms from Angular Forms, more specifically the form control object. And that form control object is going to be bound to a select element like this. So I use the form control directive to bind my continent select to that dropdown right here. And the idea is that in the constructor of that component, I use that form control, which exposes one observable called value changes. So value changes is an observable that comes from the Angular framework, and I subscribe to it. And with that subscription, what I do is that I'm going to receive the value and assign it to the current selection variable here. So current selection has nothing by default. And when we select a new value, this observable is going to emit. So this function is going to be called, and we should see the selection on the screen, because the idea is that that current selection is displayed with an expression here, which is going to show up right there. So for now, there's nothing. If I go here and select Europe, you see you selected Europe. And we see that because that subscription works really. And whenever I selected something new, value changes emitted a value was received here, and we see the result. So if I change again to North America, things get updated and we receive the new value. So that's reactive programming in action, right? That's reactive programming. As soon as I change something, the application works with that update, changes things, and gives us immediate feedback, right? And this code just does what we expect it to do. It reacts to my action, to the data change, and displays the updated information right away. So I see a few questions in the chat. That's great. Keep them coming. Some of them I'm going to cover later. Others, I'm going to cover them as I see them. So for instance, there's a question here. Can we subscribe to an observable when certain conditions are true? And yeah, the answer is yes. Subscribing to an observable is just a line of code that we run whenever we want to. So if I wanted to make this conditional, I could absolutely do that. Let's see if I can fork that example and make a quick change to it. Yes, I'm going to create a variation here in my template. I'm going to add a button, and in that button, I'm going to call it track changes. So that's the button that's going to trigger the subscription really to the observable. On click, I'm going to call a method that I'm going to call track changes, something like this. And now I have to define that new method. So I go to my component, I add track changes in here, and I'm just moving the code from the constructor to here. And now we need that trigger really to have the subscription happen. So if I select a value right now, nothing happens. See, now I select Europe, I select South America, we don't see any selection. And that's because we haven't subscribed yet. So I click on the button runs this code, creates a subscription. And now when I change things, we see the value showing up. So I decided when to subscribe programmatically by having that button that would trigger the subscription, for instance. So that's one option to control when we get data from an observable, when we decide to subscribe. So I like to compare observables to a newspaper subscription or a magazine subscription. And what I mean by this is that when you subscribe to a newspaper or a magazine, you expect to receive several issues of that newspaper or magazine over time. So you subscribe like this month and you expect to receive the next newspaper, and then the one after that, and then the one after that, and then the one after that. So you subscribe and then you expect to receive things over time. And that subscription, those magazines or newspapers, they are going to be delivered physically at a specific location, right? You give your mailing address to receive the newspaper. With RxJs, with observables, we pass a callback function. And that callback function, that's really the address. That's where the data is going to be delivered. That's the way we do that with code, right? We don't have a physical address to deliver our data. So instead we pass a function, and that function is going to run whenever there is new data available. And just like a newspaper subscription, it's likely that it's going to complete at some point. So typically, if you subscribe for a newspaper, it's going to be for like 6 months or 1 year. With observables, it can be similar. You can have observables that are going to emit for some time and then they stop, because maybe they're tracking a specific type of data that only lives for a given amount of time and then just stops emitting. But we also have observables that go on virtually forever. As long as your application is running, if the event keeps happening, they would still give you some data. But yeah, observables can also complete, just like, again, a regular newspaper subscription. So what I mentioned earlier is that the main way we deal with observables in Angular is the HTTP client, right? So it's great to make AJAX requests. It's the official Angular service to do so, make HTTP requests to the backend, works with JSON data, and returns an observable object, which means that when we work with the HTTP client, we do something that looks typically like this. HTTP.get, some URL, and we subscribe to that result, get some data, and assign the data to a variable so it gets displayed by our component, for instance. Now, the nice thing about the HTTP client is that it allows us to specify the type of the response, and that's incredibly useful. That's also one of the things that people tend to miss with RxJS and with the HTTP client. So I always insist on that, how important it is. you can really specify the type of the data you're going to receive from your backend. And that allows you to have type safety on your data. It doesn't cost anything really to just specify using that generic syntax whenever you do an HTTP get, post, put, or delete. Think about that. You can add the type here, and it's going to tell that we receive what we get from that request is an observable of that specific type of data, which means when you subscribe to that observable, the data is expected to be an array of license plate in that case. So it really allows us to document our code, really provide extra information, ensure that when another developer looks at that code, they know exactly what we're doing, they know what kind of data to expect from that method. And as a result, it's really a best practice to adopt that kind of syntax. And again, I'm mentioning it because I see a lot of people that don't do it. So it's yeah, something to think about, something to adopt. Because if you don't do this, then the HTTP client is going to assume that it's going to use the type any instead, and any could be anything, which of course doesn't have type safety, and then it basically opens the door for mistakes and things that the compiler cannot catch. So this translates into bugs at runtime, whereas if we use the proper types here, we catch those mistakes before they even happen. All right, so this is a workshop, so I'll get you to practice a little bit, and we're gonna start with a very simple exercise where you can access this StackBlitz. So stackblitz.com/edit RxJs demo 1. And we want to add a country selection dropdown that displays a list of countries from the following URL. So now we want to have a continent selection and a country selection dropdown. So I'll paste that link in the chat so you can take a look at it from here. Exercise 1. I'll let you get started with this. We'll do, this is a pretty straightforward exercise. So we'll go with just 5 minutes on this exercise. So we can spend more time when it gets a little bit more complex and a little bit more interesting. So I'll put that timer here for 5 minutes. And I'll let you get started. So StackBlitz is an online IDE. You can just click on that link and start changing the code. It's going to automatically create your own version of that code. So don't worry, you cannot break anything really. And yeah, I'll let you do that for the next few minutes, and then I'll show you a possible solution. All right, so we'll take a look at the solution. So by the way, the link to every single solution is also in my Google, in my slides. So below every single slide where we have an exercise, we have the link to a possible solution. So if you want to take a look at that, it's all in there. So you have access to both the exercise and a possible solution for that exercise. If you see that error, it's good that it happens now, that's tag blitz, that's sometimes a little bit buggy. So you just click on a refresh here and it should disappear. Sometimes takes a few attempts. There you go. So what we did in the exercise was pretty straightforward. I added so we inject the HTTP client in the constructor. And once we have that HTTP client, we make a GET request in order to have type safety. So we use that country interface, where a country is a string, which is the name of the country, and a continent, where the country is located. We make that request, subscribe to that observable, and then we set the data that we receive as the array of countries in here. And so when I click on that drop down, all of the countries get displayed. And that's because if I go to my template, we see that we have a form control with country select, and we repeat the options for every single country that we got from that observable. And as a result, we have the list of all countries that are being displayed. Now, when we select either of these things, so we also have observables for each of these drop downs, because they are based on the form controls, and since they are form controls, they have that value changes observable, and we use that value changes observable to detect whenever a new value is selected, and we display the results down here from those observables. The idea for this exercise was really to do just this for now. Just make the request, get the data, subscribe, and display the dropdown. If you were able to do that, then you're all good. So next, let's get into something very important, and something that I would say you should always be using is the async pipe. So the async pipe is an Angular pipe. It's an Angular feature that allows us to automatically subscribe and unsubscribe from an observable. And that's very important because it's going to simplify our code a lot. You don't need to call subscribe anymore. You don't need to unsubscribe when you don't need the data anymore. You can just use pipe async and you're all good to go. So I actually use that in the solution here. If you look at the template, you selected continent selection pipe async and country select dot value changes pipe async. So using pipe async here subscribes to any changes from the continent dropdown and any changes from the country selection dropdown. And we can tell that it's working because when I change either of these dropdowns, the value down here gets updated. So that simplifies the syntax quite a bit because, again, no more .subscribe or unsubscribe. It's all happening with just pipe async. So it's subscribing, getting the data, and returning it. And it's doing so in a very efficient manner. It's also optimized in the sense that when that component gets destroyed, so if we navigate to a different page, for instance, and that component gets removed from the screen, then the async pipe automatically unsubscribes from these observables. And that's a very important thing to do, to always unsubscribe from our observable when we don't use them anymore, when we don't need them, because it's going to allow JavaScript to free that memory and you don't get into a memory leak as a result. So async pipe is really a best practice and something we should always strive to use as much as possible. And my goal with this workshop is to show you that we can always use it. So there's no excuse to say, oh, but in that scenario, I need to do that, so I can't use the async pipe. It's actually never true. You can always use it. So we'll cover some examples with that in a few minutes. Let's get back to those slides. So yeah, async pipe is important. So at this point, we are using a bunch of different observables, right? We have one that makes an HTTP request. We have two observables that come from these HTML dropdowns. But the thing is that they are all independent at this point. They are not truly reactive in a sense that there's no connection between them. There's no brains driving them. And so we can do things that don't make sense in our form. Like here, I can select Europe and Australia, and that should not be possible, right? If I select Europe, the list of countries should be filtered down so we don't get those kinds of mismatches. So we'll see how RxJs can help us to achieve that kind of scenario. And basically the key to achieve this is going to be operators. So operators are a way to add extra features on top of our observables. And what's very common with RxJS is that in order to illustrate how operators works, we use this syntax, this kind of diagram that is called a marble diagram that shows a timeline. So it goes from left to right, and every number on that timeline is representing an event emitted by our observable. So in this example, the observable emits 1, 2, 3, 4. And then remember, it's a timeline. So here it takes more time, and then finally emits 5. And then after some more time, the observable completes. So this straight line here shows the completion of the observable. So it emitted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it's completed. So how do we use operators? When we use RxJS, we have observables, right? And we can apply operators to our observables using that pipe method. So here you see observable.pipe, and within that pipe method, we can list one or more different operators that are going to do something and usually return a modified observable or just modified data from that observable. So operators are going to be used to transform, filter, concatenate information from one or more sources, because sometimes you can even use operators to combine multiple observables into one thing or into more than one thing. That's also possible. You can have one source and switch it into multiple sources, or the opposite, use different sources and combine them into one result. This is what makes RxJs really, really powerful. It's also what makes it complex in a sense, because RxJs has over 120 operators available, and that's a lot. We could spend probably 2 or 3 days just focused on that, right? And learning about these operators. So what I'm going to show you instead is a selection of the most important operators. So the ones that are really essential for any Angular application. So let's take a look at that. And I'm also going to pick some operators that maybe are not that useful or that frequent, but still give you an idea of what's possible with RxJS. So the first one, and that's probably the most popular operator out there, the one that I see in the most Angular applications, is map. So the idea behind map is that it takes an observable. So here we have an observable that emits 1, 2, and 3. And if we apply the map operator to it, in that map operator, we pass a function, and that function defines a transformation. And it says, whenever we get some data, the data is called x in here, we are going to return 10 times x. And if we subscribe to the operator that comes out as a result of that mapping, if we subscribe to that new observable, we would receive 10, 20, 30. So the timing of the events remain the same, but the data that we get is 10 times the original data, right? That's the idea. So that's map, and this is used a lot in Angular because very often the data that we get from the server doesn't have the shape that we expect. We want to just extract one piece of that data or change it a little bit, and map is a perfect way to do that. So let's take a look at a demo of map. So down here, we make our HTTP requests to get countries, and we have the value changes observable on our continent. We use pipe, so we can use operators. And I'm going to talk about tap in a few minutes, but for now, let's focus on map. So map takes our selected continent and just extracts the first 3 letters and turn them to uppercase. So it takes the 3 first letters, turn them to uppercase, which means when we subscribe to it later on, my current continent selection, instead of being the entire continent name, is going to be just the 3 first letter to uppercase, because we made that transformation here. So let's give this a try. I select Europe, and my selection is EUR uppercase, thanks to that operator that made a transformation. If I select Africa, I get AFR. So it's still reactive, it's still using an observable, but now we are applying transformations So we get a different result, and the data gets tweaked, customized, so we can deal with it in the way that we expect. In that scenario, the assumption is maybe we need a 3-letter code out of that continent, and that's how we create that 3-letter code out of our data. So that's the map operator. That's a very important one, very useful one. And it's just one of many. The next one I want to show you, or before I get into the next one, is this other slide where, earlier I told you that when we use RxJs, it's really like a newspaper subscription or a magazine subscription. And if we apply the operators to that idea, to that mindset, if you subscribe to a newspaper or a magazine, it's very likely that you don't read everything, right? You're going to focus on some subsets of that newspaper. Maybe you like the sports and you're only going to read the sports news very in depth, right? Or maybe you're just looking for coupons to get, rebates on stuff, and you go to those pages, and you probably have your own routine of what you're going to do with that magazine or newspaper and focus on some subpart. That's exactly what operators are about. They tweak what we do with a subscription to make it match our expectations. That's really the way to think about it. That's the idea. So you get a big bunch of data and you want to increase your focus or really extract what you really need from that data. And because of that, most operators are all about filtering data, aggregating information, and things like that. They're all about, tweaking information, managing it in a way that makes it more useful. So that's very important, because sometimes we need that and sometimes we don't. So if you don't use an operator, don't feel bad about it. Maybe it's because you don't need to tweak that data. So don't feel like you have to use operators. It's only when we need to make changes that we would use them. So now I want to show you a few more examples of operators. This one, max, is very interesting because it not only changes the data, it's also changing when the data gets emitted. So it's a mathematical operator. It only returns one value, no matter how many values are emitted by the source observable. So here we have an observable that emits numbers 2, 30, 22, 5, 60, 1, and then completes. When it completes, the max operator is going to finally emit a value and complete at the same time. And the value it emits is the maximum value that was ever emitted by the input observable. In that case, it was 60, the maximum value. So if you create an app that tracks prices, stock prices, exchange rates, number of points scored by a team or whatever, things with numbers, and you have observers that give you a data source with those values over time, you could use max to track the maximum value and display it when the source stops emitting. For instance, that's a possible use case. It's not very often that we use it, but it's important to know that it exists, right? That's one of the things that's available when we have an observable. Oh, I see a very good question. How to know if a subscription is complete? That's a very good point, and I'm going to illustrate that right now. So when we subscribe to an observable, we pass one function right now. We could actually pass a lot more than one. we can pass up to 3 different functions. We could pass a second function to handle errors. And if there's any error, they would get caught in here. And in my scenario, I'm just going to do a console log of those errors. And we can have a third function. And this one would be called when the subscription completes. So that's how we can know, that's one way we have to know that a subscription gets completed. So you can, when you subscribe, you can pass 1, 2, 3 callbacks. And the third one, it's always in that order. The third one is what happens when the subscription is complete. So that's one trigger, one way you can register to receive that information. So that was the max operator, the one I used earlier, and that's a very important one to know about. Same thing, this is very much underused by Angular developers, but this one can be a lifesaver. And so I really recommend everyone to use it. It's an operator that's really basic. It's called tap. And when you look at that marble diagram, it seems a little bit weird because it doesn't change anything. So it's an operator that you can plug in your observable and it doesn't change the data. So what's the point of tap then? Well, you can use it to spy what's going on with your observable. So logging, of course, is one of the most common use cases, which is great for debugging. So you can see what's going on, especially when you have 3, 4, 5 different operators. It can be tricky to visualize what's going on at every single step. So when you debug, you can just add tap in between every single step, and then you'll see what happens at every step of the way, right? And that's a great way to really visualize and get a better understanding of what you're doing. And that way you don't need any breakpoints or anything. You can just use a few taps to see what's happening and debug things. So I did that in the previous example, actually. Let's go back there. If we go to our code, you can see that I had a tap before map and one after. And the reason for this is so we can see, so both of them, they just console log the result. And the idea is if I select a continent, like Asia, we see Asia and then ASI. So I can tell that my tap is working and map is doing the right thing because it all gets logged to the console. So that's great to debug and ensure that we're doing the right thing because you can really see it in action. As I click, I can see tap logging things. And then when it's fully working and I'm happy with the result, I can just remove those operators from my operator chain and I'm good to go. So I see a few comments and questions here. So yeah, if you use the latest version of RxJs, the subscription syntax is a little bit different with the latest version, or it was also available with the older versions. You can now pass an object in here, and that object has up to 3 keys. The first one is next. So that's what to do with the next value. And that's where we're going to plug our next function like this. Then we have error, and that's where we're going to plug our errors callback. And finally, we have complete. where we are going to have the completion callback, which is actually better, I would say, from a clarification perspective, because now we can tell it's not just the order, like first callback, second callback, third callback. It's really the name of the property that makes it what's next, how to deal with errors, how to deal with completion. So this works. This is the more modern syntax. And then the advantage of this is you can just use one of the callbacks. So if you're only interested in completion, you can just remove these two and add the complete option, for instance. Or if you only want to catch errors, you can do that as well. Another question, will form control value changes ever fire complete? No, because the form, the element is always there. So it's just gonna fire values as we select them, but then it just, if it's removed from the screen, it gets destroyed. So it doesn't even have the time to complete. So this form controller value changes never really completes. One that always completes, though, is the HTTP request. So if you do an HTTP GET, you're going to get the data, and then it completes instantly. So that would be a good one to illustrate the complete scenario. Yeah. I see a couple more questions that I'm going to get into. So next and complete. So yeah, Jan is asking, so would you not use next in HTTP? We do. If you want the data, you need to use next, because the completion callback doesn't have any data, right? That complete callback function has no params. It just tells you I'm done. So you cannot get the latest value from that callback. It's just saying us we're done, right? And as a result, you still need next if you want to get the value. Yes, so Greg saw the deprecation warning, and that was before. So when I used the other syntax without next, error, and complete, so the syntax with just 3 different callbacks as a param and not an object, that syntax is now deprecated. So that's when you would see that strike over subscribe, because it would tell us that we're not supposed to use that syntax anymore, that we're supposed to use the object with keys and values instead. So that's why you saw that briefly before I migrated to this syntax here. Yeah. So in this example, where would we use max, inside subscribe or after map? So in this one, I'm not going to use max because it's not numbers we're dealing with, and there's no completion of the observable, so it's hard to illustrate it. So I can't really use it. There's no meaningful use case for max in that specific scenario. But if I wanted to use it, if we got numbers from that, it would just be inside that pipe function. So we would do something like this, right? So that's where it would go, most likely. We would do some transformations, get a number out of it, possibly, and then extract the maximum. So that's where it would go if we would, if this was a list of numbers and we wanted to extract the maximum value out of them. But that's not the case here, so it's not going to work if I do that, so I'm going to remove it. Yes, it's a reactive form, so this one never complete. So I cannot even illustrate max if I wanted to. I would have to create a completely different example. So we talked about tap as a way to debug, but tap is more than that, because it's going to enable us to do anything we want in our TypeScript code. And it becomes especially useful when we don't want to use that subscribe function. If instead of using subscribe, we want to use the async pipe, then our custom code like this can be done within tap instead of within subscribe. And that's why it's really powerful and important to know about tap. You can use it to replace any TypeScript code you would do in a subscribe function and make it happen within tap. And that way you don't have to subscribe. You can just use the async pipe, and you're not losing any features. You're only getting more benefits out of it, because now the subscription and unsubscription is handled by the Angular framework for you. So that's another important thing to mention. And I could illustrate this in here. So let's make that change. I'm going to fork this example, and I'm going to copy all of this, cut it, and instead of subscribing, so we still do our map, and then we are going to do tap, and tap can have that exact same syntax with next error and complete. Or do I do it like this? Yes. So we can pass an object with next error and complete, and then I don't have to subscribe in here. I get the exact same benefits, and I can subscribe to that value changes. Well, I would have to assign it to a variable, subscribe to it with the async pipe, and I still have all of that code that would run. So that's why tap is a key operator, and that's the part that people tend to miss about tap. It's not just about logging things or debugging. You can also use it to replace anything you would do in a subscription when you use the async pipe. And so if you remember this, then you know the power of tap, and you realize that, yeah, you can use the async pipe all the time, because whatever you would do in your subscribe, you would do it in tap, and then you're good to go. So that's the idea. All right, some more examples of operators. Merge. So merge is a slightly different operator, and that's why I wanted to showcase that one, because it takes two or more different operators, different observables, and it's going to merge them into just one thing. So let's say you have list of some data from an HTTP request, or some data source that's emitting multiple things. You have another one, and you want to combine these two sources into just one observable with data from both places. Merge is going to do that. So here we have 60, we have 1, we have 80. So no matter how many values we get from either of these sources, they get concatenated or aggregated into that new observable that we get from merge. And something I like to showcase at that point is a website called RxMarbles.com. So I'm opening that website here, RxMarbles.com, putting the link in the chat. This is one of my favorite way to learn about operators, because it has these marble diagrams of operators, but on top of being just marble diagrams, you can also interact with them. So you can move things around and see what the result is, which for merge doesn't help that much because merge was somewhat easy to understand. We would really visualize it from the static version. But if we get into more complex operators, then the fact that we can move things around becomes very interesting and very powerful. For instance, let's say I go to that. So our RxMarbles, this website doesn't have all of them. It doesn't have all of the operators, but it has some of the most useful ones, some of the most common ones. So it's a very good place to start. Let's say I click on this one called race. So race looks like it takes several observables as a param, and it's returning 1, 2, 3 in that case. So my assumption is that it takes a value from the observable that returned first. How can I test that assumption? Let's say I take that value here and I move it to first place. And now I can see that the result is the data from that other observable. If I move 0 back here, it changes. So that interactivity is great for, I mean, it's a lot easier to understand things when we can play with them than, you know, reading a long text description about what the operator does. The RxJs documentation is good, but reading the explanations for such operators can be tricky at times. This is so much easier. I can understand it right away, right? It's very visual, it's very interactive. I like it. So yeah, RxMarbles.com, amazing website, lots of value here. Okay, so that's merged, RxMarbles. Another one that's really common with Angular applications is filter. So with filter, the idea is you receive a bunch of values and you want to filter them out and only select a subset of those values. So here I use the filter operator and I'm saying that I only want the values that are greater than 10. So the function we pass as a param determines what kind of filtering we want to do. So 2 is not greater than 10, so it doesn't make it through. 30 is greater than 10, so we receive it. 22 is greater than 10, so it goes through. 5 doesn't. 60 goes through. 1 doesn't. And so yeah, that, you know, every time you have to do filtering in Angular, like filtering based on, you know, a form selection based on values and stuff, that's really, filter is a great option. Filter is going to allow you to do that kind of stuff. combineLatest is another very interesting operator. And this is one of the operators where playing with the marble diagram from RxMarbles also helps a lot. So let's go to RxMarbles. I go to combineLatest. So combineLatest takes multiple observables, combine them, and the way it works is that we provide a function that decides how we combine the values. So X and Y refer to the value of the first observable and the second one, respectively. If you were combining three observables, you would have 3 params, essentially, in that same order. And in that scenario, we just concatenate the values. So empty space plus the value from X plus the value from Y. So it's just doing a basic concatenation, nothing fancy. And as a result, because it's doing a concatenation, once we have a value from the first one, a value from the second one, it's running that function on the latest values from both and returning it. So 1 and A gives 1A. Then when this one emits 2, it's going to combine 2 and A, and we get 2A. And then B gets emitted, so we get 2B. And then C, 2C, you get the idea. And just like before, we can move things around to ensure that it's a behavior we would expect. So if 3 happens sooner, then we get a 3B, 3C, 3D. Whereas before it would be a 2C, 2D, and 3D. So it combines the latest value of each of these 2 observables into another result. Very useful if you have multiple filters you want to apply, right? Multiple different sources. You need to combine those values and filter the output into something else. So now that you know about these operators, we're going to do exercise number 2, where we're going to get into RxJs operators in more detail and have you do the a little bit more, add some intelligence, some brains to our filtering. And the idea of this exercise is to change our drop-downs. So we still have that continent drop-down and country drop-down, but now when we select a continent, we only want to display the countries for that continent. So if I select Europe, I should not see United States or India, but only the countries of Europe. If I select North America, then we'll see Canada, Mexico, United States, and so forth. So that's your goal, and you get bonus points if you can remove all .subscribe and only use the async pipe, which is a little bit more challenging, but fun. So for this exercise, we'll do a little bit more time because there's more complexity here. I'll give you 10 minutes and I'll let you get started. If you have any questions or any problems, feel free to use the chat to ask around, and I'll be here to help you out. All right, so let's take a look at a possible solution for this exercise. I'm not going to live code it because it would take too much time. So instead, I'll go to the solution and walk you through it step by step. So here, and I added lots of comments in the solution to explain what's really going on. So we decide, so the idea is we have a few different observables going on here. We have the HTTP request to get our countries. We have the continent selection dropdown, and we have the country selection dropdown. So all of them have an observable, which means we have 3 different observables that have to work together to get a proper reactive result. So what's really driving things, there are 2 main observables that drive a lot of things here. The first one is the country selection observable, the one that gets a list of countries, right? HTTP request. So I start by declaring that one and saying, this is the HTTP client get request to get an array of countries. And then I define that our list of continents, well, the current continent we select, we're going to use the value changes observable from the dropdown. And we are going to do something here, which is that we use pipe so we can apply operators. And the first operator I'm going to use is with latest from, which allows us to combine the country selection with the latest, not country selection, but really continent selection. We combine the currently selected continent with the latest list of countries. So if the user selects Europe, we combine them with the latest result from the observer that has all of the countries. So this gives us an array. When you use with latest from, which might be documented here, yes. So you either get 2 X and Y like this, or an array with everything in it. And in our case, I took the array approach. So what I'm getting is an array with the current selection from the user, the current continent that is selected, and all of the countries in the world that come from our HTTP request. And I'm going to use map because I want to transform that list of countries and filter it out. So we only display the countries for the current continent. So we're still going to return an array with 2 values. So I create that array. First value is still the continent, and the second value is our list of countries that I'm going to filter. And this is the array filter function, right? Not the RxJs operator. I'm just filtering the array of countries by the current continent. And map is going to do that. And now when we get to that third step, we have the current continent and we have a list of filtered countries. So we assign the filtered countries to the list of countries. We reset the dropdown to select the first value, just to ensure that something gets selected and it's a new value. And then we still do the mapping that we had before to have the continent all uppercase and 3-letter code. And see that I don't subscribe. So we have a bunch of observables, lots of operators, no subscription, which means that in our HTML, it's almost as clean and a minimalist as before, because this is the async pipe that's going to subscribe to that big chain of events, right? This continent selection here is the one that's triggering all of these side effects and filtering and combinations and mapping. And async pipe takes care of subscribing and unsubscribing. So my HTML remains super nice and easy to read. And so now if I select Europe, I have a list of European countries, and Albania was selected first because it was the first one of the list. If I select North America, I have a list of countries from North America. If I select South America, I have the countries of South America, and it's just doing it, right? So every time we change one of these values, we get back into that pipe, right? The value changes, triggers this, get the latest countries from the HTTP request, does the mapping, filtering, goes through all of these steps. And yeah, we're always in sync. We know that nothing wrong can happen here because it's reactive, and our rules that drives how to combine these different observables are clearly defined in that code. So question, there is no subscription or async pipe for the country request. How does that request run? It runs because of this, with latest from. So because we say that we combine the value changes with the latest value from that observable, this operator is going to subscribe for us. So it's really this async pipe that's triggering it. Because we subscribe to the continent observable, which itself depends on the latest value from the country observable, it also creates that subscription. The operator here is doing it for us. Yeah. But yeah, that's a great question because there was no obvious subscription that was visible in here. And so yeah, all of that code relies on just that one async pipe down here. So yeah, when I told you earlier that you can still do anything you want and use the async pipe, this one is a great example. We do a lot of things and we use a lot of operators and we don't subscribe. So if the API fails, we get an error. And if we get an error in an observable, errors are not fun with RxJS because if there's an error, then the subscription stops. So any further selection in the future would do nothing. Basically, it breaks the observable chain and everything, and we would get nothing. So in order to handle errors, what we would need to do is add a catch error operator. So there's an operator for that, catch error. And here we could, most likely the only thing we can do is display an error to the user, right? Because if the API fails, we can't really recover. There's nothing we can do on the client side. We really rely on that server. So we would probably display an alert to the user, something went wrong, try again later, or that kind of message. And of course, we can make it nice and more meaningful than this. But yeah, that would be the one possible way to do it. And I actually have to, if I use catch error, I have to return another observable as well, which would return an empty array so it can keep going and not failing. But yeah, that would be the way to handle it. So using catch error or error in one of these tabs down here, that would do as well. So we know that we have a fallback scenario, or we just provide some feedback to the user about that error. So yeah, that's the description of everything we just went through. If there's any other questions on that, let me know. I know this one has quite a few operators. And this is a pretty common scenario in Angular apps, right? To connect different drop-downs together and do something based on the user selection. If you have complex forms with multiple different filters and things, connecting them together, that's a pretty common scenario. And yeah, you don't need to know about the 120 RxJs operators. This small subset here, so map, tap, with latest from, switch map are the the good ones that get a lot of things done out of the box. So we saw how to subscribe to an observable, how to use operators. Now, how can we control when and how to emit data with RxJs? That's going to be our last section for today. So RxJS allows us to create our own observables if we want to, because the observable object, there is a class observable that you can use, and you can create a new observable like so. The way it works is that you pass a function as a param, and that function defines what to do and when to emit values. The function takes an observer object as a param, and observer has 3 methods. Next, to return the next value to all subscribers. Complete, called when the data has been sent. So when all data has been sent to subscribers and we're done emitting. And error, when an error occurs. So just like we can register 3 different callbacks when we subscribe to an observable, we have 3 different methods that we can call within an observable to control, what the subscribers are going to receive. So next, complete, and error. So this would be the manual process if we wanted to create our brand new observable from scratch and make it emit data completely under our control. Now, this works, but it's not super convenient. So what RxJS did instead is that the library gave us a specific type of object called a subject. And a subject is a special type of observable that allows values to be sent to many subscribers. So a subject is a kind of magic in a sense that it is an observable, but it is also an event emitter. It's also something you can use to emit data to all of the subscribers to that observable. So for instance, I can do subject.next, pass some data to it, and then I can expose that subject as an observable and have components, services, anything we want, subscribe to it and receive those values, which is a lot easier in terms of syntax than creating our own observable manually. So instead we rely on these subjects. And there's actually different kinds of subjects that come out of the box with RxJS. So subject, BehaviorSubject, ReplaySubject, and Async subject. And in order to properly show you what's the difference between all of them, I'm gonna get into that demo here. Put the link in the chat as well. So in this example, we have a few different components. Component 1, component 2, and the idea is that we have a country service, And that country service keeps track of what's the current selection, what's the current country that we have selected. So country service has a subject to manage the current country. It has a setter that components can call when they want to change the selected country. And all we do in that setter is use the subject to emit the change. So this.country.next country. And it has a getter, which returns an observable of country. And it's just exposing our subject as an observable. And we do so that we expose a read-only version of the subject. We don't want all of the components to be able to mess with that data. So the as observable allows us to expose a read-only observable that you can only subscribe to. You cannot emit values in it. That's why as observable was created. So these components, there's two of them. A card component is this one here. And all it does is inject country service and subscribe to that current country observable and displays the current country. So if I select Denmark, let's say I click here, you see that that component displays Denmark, Europe. And it got it from that subscription. If I click on another country, Dominican Republic, the component receives it and get that data right away from that subject because of the subscription we have here. The component at the top, the way it emits those values just by calling our country service. So when I click on any of these countries, it does country service.set current country, and that's it. So clicking on these buttons is emitting a value in our subject. And because that component is subscribed, it receives the updates right away. So we have a service, the service handles that subject, and then any subscribers receive it. So if I add more card components, like I added a second one here, which is exactly the same component as this one, you can see that it doesn't have a country yet. And that's because it subscribed after this value was emitted. If I click on Denmark again, then they both receive the value. So you only start receiving the value after you have subscribed. Of course, you cannot receive things from the past, right? So if I add another component right now, it doesn't have any country selection. We would need to emit another value for it to be here. So that's how a simple subject works, right? Simple subject, just gonna emit values over time, and then your subscribers receive those values as they get emitted. But you only get the next value, you don't get the previous one. So it's like, you turn on the TV, if something happened 10 seconds ago, you missed it. You won't know what happened 10 seconds ago. You cannot replay it. A regular subject is like that. But the thing is, it would be good when a new subscriber comes in that they know what the current selection is, what was the last country that was selected. And so for that purpose, we have another kind of subject called a behavior subject. And a behavior subject is a subject that always has a value. So when we create it, we have to pass a default value to it. In that scenario, I used France. So my component gets created, it has France, Europe already there. If I add another component, same thing, it's going to have that France, Europe already there. And now I can select other countries and both of them receive that value. Now, if I add another component, what do you think it's going to say? If I add another card, is it going to have any country displayed? And if so, which one? Is it going to say France? Is it going to say nothing? Or is it going to be Dominican Republic? What do you think? You say France, but that would not be useful, right? Because that's not correct. The current selection is Dominican Republic. Let's add a card component, and it says Dominican Republic. Because these three components are subscribed to that same behavior subject. The current value remains in memory in the behavior subject. It's like a cache. And so whenever you subscribe, you receive the last value automatically. And that's very powerful and very useful. So if I emit Denmark, all of my components have Denmark. If I add a new subscriber, it also receives Denmark. So yeah, our behavior subject holds a current value. It kind of acts as a cache of the latest value and replays it to any new subscriber, which is really, really useful and powerful. There's another kind of subject that is somewhat similar, and it's called ReplaySubject. The only difference with ReplaySubject is that it doesn't require a default value. Instead, it takes a number as a param, and that number determines how many of the latest value to replay to a new subscriber. So I'm logging everything in the console. So if I click Denmark, we see card 1 received Denmark. If I click Dominica, card 1 received Dominica. Dominican Republic, card 1 received Dominican Republic. So every time we emit something, it gets logged by the component. I received that value. Now, if I add another card component, what's happening is the following thing, where our new card is also up to date, but it received the last 2 values when it's subscribed. It received Dominica and it received Dominican Republic because the replay subject has a size of 2. So it received the last 2 values, one after the other. So this replay subject can be interesting if you have to display a list of the last 10 notifications that you got from a notification system. So you want to keep track of the last 10, you can use a replay subject of size 10, and then whenever a component subscribes to it, it would receive the last 10 notifications, for instance. In the case of my country thing, it doesn't help really, but just an example, right, to illustrate what replay subject does. And the last type of subject is async subject. Async subject is completely different. This one doesn't emit anything unless we call complete. So it will only emit the last value upon completion of the observable. So it just keeps track of the last value, but doesn't emit it, and it's only going to send it to all of the subscribers when we complete. So it's a way to keep track of something and then only emit it when we want to. So it's a different approach. It's rare that we would need it. I don't think I've ever used it in production code, but it's another type of subject that we have available. So I see a question. You said 2, but if we did not have more than 2, what would happen? If you had nothing, then you would only receive nothing. And if you had just 1 value, you would just receive that value. So 2 is the maximum of items that you would receive. If it's less, you receive less. If it's more, then you receive 2. Yeah. So in other words, it doesn't fail if you don't have anything. If I refresh the example and restart from scratch using my replay subject, I add new cards, they subscribe, they receive nothing because we haven't emitted anything. And then I click on Denmark, so I emit 1, they all receive that 1 thing. I emit Djibouti, they all receive Djibouti because we have that value. And now if I had another component, it's going to receive those two values instantly. So yeah, 2 is the maximum size. It's not a requirement to have 2 items waiting in that queue. And so yeah, that's subjects and the essence of what we can do with subjects. We only have a few minutes left, so I don't think we would have the time for this exercise. What I can do instead is show you the solution of exercise number 3 and explain what's going on with that solution. And then yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll answer those questions in the last couple of minutes. So the idea of the exercise here was to create a service that's going to call an API every 30 seconds to get currency exchange rates. So every 30 seconds, it will make a request to a server and get fresh data. So the service I created looks like this. So this is the URL where we get the exchange rates. I create a ReplaySubject of size 1 so that new subscribers receive the latest value. And we don't have default values for the exchange rate, so I cannot really use a BehaviorSubject because a default value would most likely be wrong. So I'm using a ReplaySubject of size 1. Then I'm starting my timer here. So timer is another function from another operator function from RxJs. 0 means start right now, and then keep emitting a value every 30 seconds. So this timer function is just going to emit a value right now, and then another one in 30 seconds, and then another one 30 seconds later. And what it emits is just a number. So it starts with 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. So that number itself, we don't really care about it in our scenario here. So what I do instead is I switch it. I use the switch map operator to change that value into an HTTP request to get the latest exchange rate from the API. And then I log that to the console, and I subscribe and emit the value into my subject. So that every 30 seconds, we make a request to the server. When we receive the result, it gets emitted in our subject. And the component here is subscribing to that subject using the async pipe and displaying the latest value, which are always the same because it doesn't change that often. But if we look at the console, we can see that we have Euro, GBP, USD. So these are the 6 HTTP requests that have happened since I opened this tab. So I see a few questions already. When we subscribe to Observable, it's crucial to unsubscribe. I want the best practice to do that. The best practice is to use the async pipe. If you use the async pipe, you always unsubscribe automatically. If you are in a service, like I'm doing in here, in that service, what I did is I captured my subscription and I used ng on destroy to unsubscribe. So that's the idea. So that was question number 1. That's how we unsubscribe. Question number 2 was, let's see, isn't that a nested subscription? It isn't, because we don't have a subscribe. We don't call .subscribe inside another subscribe. We just emit it to something else. So we're forwarding into another observable, but we only have one subscription. I see you do only session in the constructor. Is it better than on init? It's not necessarily better. It's almost the same thing. ng on init was created when you have inputs. So if you use inputs in a component inside ng on init, you know that all of the inputs have a default value. And that's the only reason for ng on init to exist, which means that if my component or service, well, services don't have inputs, so it even makes more sense to use a constructor. But yeah, if a component doesn't have any inputs, then I can do it in a constructor. There's no need to wait for inputs to have values if we don't need those inputs, or if we don't even have inputs in the first place. So no need for ng on init, I can do it in the constructor. Next question, how to handle many subscriptions for a single subject without memory leakage? Same thing, async pipe, always. That's what I'm doing here. This rates $, that's my subject. I'm using pipe async. There cannot be any memory leak if you unsubscribe. And when you use the async pipe, you automatically unsubscribe. So it's always the safest way to go. So see, that's a very common pattern here. I get my service, and instead of subscribing in TypeScript, I just get the observable from my service. I store it in a component property, and then the subscription is going to happen with the async pipe. And that way, I don't have to subscribe, I don't have to unsubscribe. It's all done automatically by Angular. So we're almost out of time. If you have other questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Just the last few things I want to mention. So this is my last slides with the link to my slides, my email address. If you have any questions later on and want to reach out, feel free to do so. My blog, if you want to get information about Angular every week, you can go to the blog, subscribe to the newsletter, and receive all of these new content every week. It's happening every Wednesday or Thursday usually. And if you enjoyed this session, you can buy me a cup of coffee as a thank you. And I put the link to that in here. I'll put it again in the chat because it's easier to click it that way. A link to the slide, same thing. I'm going to put it in the chat as well. Yeah, thanks for the feedback in the chat. That's great to know that this helps clarify things. That was the goal, really. Being as helpful as possible. Starting from scratch helps, clearing any misconceptions and really doing things in a different manner. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming today. Thanks for all of your questions. If you have anything else, you can reach out by email. And the recording of this session is going to be published in a few days. So you'll be able to find it on my website, courses.angulartraining.com, and it's also going to be on YouTube. So it's going to be in a few different places. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming today. Thanks for your feedback. And yeah, see you next month, maybe for the next workshop.